Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about a show called Atypical. So, recently I went into Netflix and I was like, you know what, let's spin the wheel of something to watch. Because ultimately, I'm really trying my best to really just try and just siphon through Netflix and try to at least do something from Netflix. So I think, if anything, if people don't have any other app, at least they probably do at least have a Netflix, even though reasonably it might not be a heavy thing that they watch compared to a lot of things, but who knows? Because budgets of people and whatever, what have you. So, going into this, so let's ultimately talk about Atypical. So, going on into this movie or this show, what is Atypical about? So we ultimately have a character who is named Sam that is within this family, and he ultimately is autistic. And so we have this journey of a character that ultimately struggles through kind of like common day to day things, and we ultimately eventually find Sam eventually ending up doing things that would otherwise probably maybe get some people probably arrested or otherwise just we would have it to where like Sam kind of does things that ultimately uh, some people just have to get used to. So going into this show, I thought that this show was really well rounded. Like, I don't feel like anyone is really like, with the exclusion maybe Sam. Like, it kind of feels like everybody in the show is getting their time, which I like about that. I enjoy the fact that it seems that the individual, when they kind of break down each individual person of this family, because it's a family kind of show, like they have like stories that are really and truly fascinating. And ultimately, when we kind of plop down each one of these characters, like I thought, like, man, they like all of these characters kind of to me like speak out as being very much like one of a kind like characters that it was just fascinating to just kind of like, if you want to say the word, like peel back their kind of stories, then yeah, to kind of like go like, I want to turn to that next page and see what this character is gonna be providing me in this episode, is kind of the fascination of uh, of this family. So going on into here, we ultimately have Sam, who has a therapist that is working through his issues, and we ultimately seemingly have it to where also this family is also going through therapies and stuff like that, and we really have it to where some people in this family get to a breaking point where they are just like, okay, like I need to kind of take my time processes and stuff like that, and ultimately they go and they take their time. It I thought it was really rather interesting how we, like, as a whole family, it kind of feels like one character is consistently getting neglected, and ultimately that is ultimately Casey. And recently in this show, you just kind of see where she just kind of has to be fine with a lot of things, because ultimately it seems that uh, everything has to just be that she finds out about something later, or she ultimately is just like, it doesn't really feel like Casey, like her family, like 100% like everything about her really matters, or this and that. And I just thought like Casey was just kind of like fascinating, her rebellious side, where eventually she lands upon where she lands in this show. So I really liked this show. I thought that I've seen a lot of these kind of like family kind of shows, if you want to kind of put it in that kind of category. But uh, when looking at it, this is a family show that eventually like branches out into be almost like a community like show, because it seems that every person in this community seemingly gets affected by either Sam's character or even Casey's character in some perspective or some way of which. So yeah, I thought this show was really just enjoyable. I thought reasonably we have it to where Doug ultimately is kind of like, I've seen him in other shows, and normally he would just be the guy that has to just kind of I gotta deliver all these jokes, I gotta deliver all these things. Like I think if anything, it's kind of nice that like Doug is just kind of like the like overly nice character, and Doug or Michael Rappaport Rappaport. Um, ultimately, Michael ultimately is like, he's a very soft character, and I'm really liking Michael's softness and delivery of this character, and how he's like really trying to be a mentor for Sam, and like I really like Michael's character. He's really enjoyable. Like Elsa, I really like her like rebelliousness, and ultimately when it seems that she is kind of having a conscious moment into, or a kind of a somebody in her, or something in her brain is kind of telling her it's that she should spill the beans or whatever, because eventually what is going on with her character is eventually going to spill out at some point, whether it's from her own consciousness or her own brain or whatever, or some other factor. But eventually, I love it where Sam eventually, like his real true, if you want to say his goals of this season, like I thought that that was kind of really interesting, like what Sam tries to accomplish within the season, let's just say, and eventually the person he meets, let's just say, to get him through that goal. Eventually we have Paige on the show, where reasonably I thought that this girl was really fascinating. If anything, I'm like, I want to kind of like, if anything, like if you want to have to go with a an onion analogy, like I want to kind of like, I want to understand like Paige's backstory more. Like I want to kind of peel back the layers and kind of understand that character of like, why is it that she is the way she is in this show. Like I thought that it was really fascinating, and it seems that even Julia is also like, it's like every like there is no like, honestly, for the most point, it doesn't feel like there really is a small part in this show. And that's the thing that I like about most. It's like I'm almost talking about the entire cast because I feel like I have to, because with this show, it's like, yeah, it ties into the family first, but eventually branches out more, and it kind of becomes a community of people, which ultimately have these little these ties to play to this story. Um, and if anything, yeah, you could say it's like, well, if anything, the focal point is still on Sam, but still, it's like there are some like, ooh, I want to see like where this goes with this person. Ooh, I want to see what little thing kind of goes on here, and ooh, I want to, ooh, what's going on, and so on and so forth, and more and more and more. So, if anything, yeah. So yeah, Julia, who ultimately goes in the journey of which she kind of key. You get little snippets of her story. I just thought like all of this cast fascinating. I just thought it was really just like is a real like just like it was getting me hooked every episode, and I thought that the way that they did that was really smart. Like it wasn't like towards the very tail end of every episode it would just be like, oh well, this is the reason why you have to watch the next episode because this little tail end thing. No, it just kind of felt like that throughout every episode was just like, oh well, you're definitely going to go into once you hit the very first episode, you're going to keep wanting to keep again, trying to use that onion analogy, peel back the layers of every single one of these characters. But if anything, I think like Paige was like the most fascinating character, and in spoilers, I'll explain why. Um, so let's go into spoilers about this show because ultimately I want to kind of crack this very first season out without a doubt. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's probably about that time to ultimately talk about the show because I thought it was interesting and I liked it. So spoiler time. Whew. So Atypical. So you ultimately have it to where we get to find out that this family is a broken family. We really have it to where eventually, where Doug ultimately had at some point stepped out on this family. And we eventually find that Elsa, who is, of course, the wife of this family, ultimately is to seemingly go and have an affair and go with another man that she had ultimately met at some bar. And it seems like this guy who is otherwise with Elsa is just kind of consistently Nick is like consistently just kind of going after her consistently. Elsa is ultimately trying to like hold him off and put him at bay, but reasonably like Nick is just gonna consistently push further, and towards the very end of this episode I thought that that was an interesting journey to go into. So ultimately we get to Casey, which is a track and field-ish like person. It seems like she is becoming close to get some scholarship somewhere, and eventually she is also to land coincidentally almost at the same time a boyfriend named Eric who had ultimately stolen a tuba at some point, and he seems to be the bad boy if you kind of want to label him that. So now we ultimately make our way to Sam. Again, Sam is a autistic guy, which otherwise I don't want to like that seems like a label, and I hate that. Like this Sam. So we ultimately have Sam, who, at the very beginning of this first episode, is ultimately talking to his therapist, kind of talking through some things. We find out that seemingly Sam is ultimately a person that consistently likes to talk about certain facts of things to the point of utter exhaustion, just because he just likes talking about things, and he ultimately likes he wants people to learn more about these things. But we also find some little things here and there about Sam's backstory, about like some mistakes he had made because he didn't know any better. Because ultimately we have it to where any little thing at some point could ultimately trigger uh, like a thing for Sam. But anyways, so we have it to where Sam is talking to uh, talking to Julia about even at some point like that he loves penguins or he loves Antarctica and all this kinds of jazz. And so you ultimately have it to where Sam is ultimately wanting to eventually make a seemingly goal, it seems, for himself. Because it seems that he is working at this like Apple store, or it's not exactly Apple, but it's kind of the Apple store equivalent. seems like he's a techie that works on computers, and he of course works on that with uh, Zahid. I believe that's how it's pronounced. And so ultimately, we have it to where Sam is ultimately talking to Julia, who's his therapist, and ultimately mentioning that his goal is to eventually find a girlfriend. And so, like, reasonably, that whole journey of this season is to get us there. And so, ultimately, at first, we find Sam, because I think we might have to just kind of like what we might have to do is we might have to talk about Sam a lot and then like pivot to other characters, because that's kind of the round robin thing that we're probably gonna have to do with this show. Because Sam, I could talk like a very long time about Sam and then probably kind of piddle in the little kind of ties to the other characters, because Sam is like Sam is the like he's tied into everybody, and even though he's like this is a family show and it gets to a point of community, but like Sam is always kind of like connected to everything. Like he's not the focus point, but at every single time, but he's just kind of connected to everything. So we ultimately have it to where Sam ultimately is talking about getting a date possibly, and that seems to be the next rung of things. But Sam doesn't quite understand having a girlfriend, and so reasonably we have it to where uh, Sam is to watch videos on YouTube to ultimately figure out how he can pick up girls, and ultimately those pickup lines are something that Sam doesn't quite understand, because ultimately the pickup lines are to ultimately like ridicule the girl to ultimately get her to like him. Like it seems like he's trying to go through everything kind of like step by step and try to justifiably uh, like do these things that a person says, but he doesn't know exactly how they all work. And so ultimately, we have it to where Sam is at first almost coming to realize that maybe he likes his own therapist. And it seems that at some point we have Sam who is ultimately asking Julia what her favorite flower is, what her favorite this is, what her favorite that is. So we eventually have it to where Sam is to try to talk to women, and ultimately what he says isn't exactly working. And so reasonably we eventually have it to where Sam goes and tries to talk with his mom to get him to go shopping at a mall, because ultimately we have it to where Elsa just kind of steps out and goes to a bar or goes to somewhere else to meet with Nick. But eventually we have it to where Sam is like, you know what? I would love to go to a mall to ultimately go shopping. And Elsa is just like, well, how about I go shopping and I'll just send you pictures and then you can just approve whether or not you want certain clothes or not. And Sam's like, no, I want to go shopping. So Sam ultimately goes to Elsa to ultimately ask to go shopping, and we ultimately have uh, we ultimately have uh, Zahid, who ultimately goes with them, because ultimately Sam ultimately is Sam trusts Hazim's opinion, and because ultimately in the very first episode, Azim ultimately suggests for Sam to get a chocolate strawberry that Sam ultimately gives to his therapist by sneaking into her house and ultimately leaving a piece of it in her home. and because Sam doesn't quite understand privacy, and ultimately Sam had been told that Julia has a boyfriend, and but he's still trying to win Julia over because he doesn't know any better. We ultimately have in the very first episode that that Doug is ultimately trying to mentor his son, but I guess he's not quite understanding all the factors of everything. Because we have it to where ultimately Sam is, and I'll get back to the clothes thing in a minute. I just want to get to this one thing, and we'll kind of bounce back. So, Doug is ultimately talking, or Sam's ultimately talking to Doug uh, about uh, about a girl that he likes, but ultimately she has a boyfriend, and so Doug ultimately goes is like, well, like I ultimately won your mother over when she was with somebody else, and so that gives Sam the confidence to think that he could win over Julia, which would make no real rational sense. So that's what he tries to do. He tries to give her some fruit. He tries to sneak into her house. Ultimately, it seems that her boyfriend works odd hours, so hence why justifying Sam trying to sneak in this person's house. But Doug is ultimately with him while he sneaks in there, so ultimately he tries to cut him off at trying to sneak into this house, and like what he's doing is wrong. And so ultimately we have it to where there is a drop of strawberries that is in Julie's house, and eventually she calls her boyfriend on it. It's like, oh my god, like, are you having an affair on me? Like, what are you doing? And ultimately you have it to where this boyfriend is like, no, like I'm not doing anything, which ultimately kind of causes a ruckus in that relationship. But anyways, so now back to this store story. So we ultimately have it to where Sam is, and God, am I tangenting all over the place with this review? But we end up having Sam ultimately getting clothes, and ultimately we have Sam getting a blue whale shirt, which ultimately I'm just like, okay, I guess that could be a conversation starter, I guess. Like ultimately I've kind of worn a lot of odd and or weird shirts at the end of the day, so I guess it's just a conversation starter. And then he gets like a biker jacket. I'm like, a biker jacket? Like it seems kind of old fashioned, but I guess it still works. So we ultimately have it to where they go and they get these items because ultimately Elsa had been kicked out of this store because it seems that Elsa was trying to get this store clerk to make it so where Sam has a much more pleasant shopping experience because he is who he is. And we have it to where ultimately this store clerk wasn't going to do anything to help this person who is in, let's just say, need. So we have it where Elsa gets so frustrated that she ends up being kicked out of the store, and ultimately Sam and Azid ultimately go and finish shopping, and then they end up leaving. So we end up having it to where eventually that Sam ultimately is desperately like trying to figure out the Rubik's cube of women, which is kind of interesting because it's like, man, it's hard enough for like any guy to get any woman, and much far enough. We basically just have like Sam like get a woman just like drop right in front of him, and ultimately like Sam ultimately is reasonably just kind of pushing her away. Because ultimately we have it to where Paige is ultimately asking Sam about like being like studying, like being a tutor for her, because ultimately Paige asks Sam, it's like, hey, you're getting like an A in this class, and I'm getting like an A minus. Like, how about like you help me study and you can help me get my grades up? And Sam is like, well, why would I do that if I have an A and like and you have an A? Like, what is the point of like that? Doesn't like if I have an A and you have an A minus, it's like, what does that benefit me? So but we have it to where Paige ultimately won't give up, and ultimately she keeps going to Sam and is ultimately just kind of asking him things, and just to like she is like consistently trying to get to him by at some point we have it to where Sam is like listening to nothing noise canceling headphones, which is kind of the high end of noise canceling headphones. And so the ultimate avatar Paige is trying to talk to Sam, and Sam is having his headphones on, which I thought was a really kind of fun moment where Paige is trying to talk to him ultimately just to kind of ask him things. And Sam is like, I have noise canceling headphones on. I won't be able to hear you. And she ultimately just keeps on talking. And Sam's like, whatever you're saying, I'm not hearing what you're saying. And she's like, could you like take those off so I can like talk to you? And so he ultimately does. And so you have to where Paige is ultimately just still like pushing to be able to study with Sam or to be able to do things with him, which I thought was really like sweet and nice and stuff like that. So now let's pivot on to other characters. So we ultimately have it, and I'm gonna have to freaking backpedal a lot. So we ultimately have Doug, who is trying to be the father that ultimately he feels that all of his kids need to be, and so reasonably we have it to where Doug is ultimately to uh, try to be whoever he needs to be for his wife. Try to go jogging next side his daughter, who is ultimately going to be in college soon because she's going to get a scholarship. And he's ultimately trying to be there. He's ultimately trying to be there for everybody. He's ultimately trying to be there for his son, and like finally like try to like be more, I guess, of a attentive dad. But at some points he makes mistakes. So recently we have it to where seemingly like this story will kind of coincide with Casey's story, and we'll kind of pivot onto there. So we ultimately find out at some point that Casey had found out that Doug had left the family. He had left because ultimately uh, Doug had told Casey he had left because uh, he ultimately could not bear to see uh, that he couldn't really help his son, and that ultimately he couldn't have his son smile and be happy and this and that. So ultimately, it just kind of wore him down over time to where eventually he just left. And we have it to where Elsa and Doug are seemingly divorced, and ultimately are going to quite possibly separate at some point. Because Elsa is going out and dating this guy Nick, who ultimately she met at a bar, and I was going to pivot off of Casey, but I guess I'm going to pivot off of Elsa. And so the Avatar Elsa is ultimately in a therapy session of girls or of women that ultimately have kids with special needs, and eventually Elsa gets Doug to go to this meeting and sorts. So we eventually have it to where Elsa is cheating with this guy, and we have it to where eventually Nick starts to ultimately start calling and or texting Elsa, And ultimately we have Elsa trying to hide this affair, trying to hide this get together of which she had with this guy, but justifiably uh, he keeps calling her, he keeps texting her, or even if she invites herself to some party, it seems like she's getting notifications from everybody in the entire world. To where ultimately it's like, well, why not just turn that off? Well, I guess you can't. You can't silence a thing, I guess. At some point, probably speak of the devil, because more than likely something will probably go off on me, and I'm like, so reasonably we have a tour reasonably going on into here. We have it to where we have Casey. So Casey is this. And Doug is also a paramedic. So a lot of the times we kind of tie in his kind of need for being able to help people. At some point, we eventually have it to where Julia ends up getting a leg injury, and Doug takes her to the hospital to ultimately help her. He ultimately uh, has to take care of Sam. When eventually Sam cuts his arm, and ultimately they have to figure out how to take care of that, and so on and so forth. Casey. So Casey is a girl that ultimately is uh, kind of the one having to just kind of deal with a lot of stuff, or just kind of swallow a lot of anger, probably, because she can't I think she's a person that kind of has to just kind of understand where everyone is coming from, and just kind of just accept what is going on a lot of the times. So we ultimately find that Casey is a track and field athlete, and it seems that immediately there seems to be some character named Evan that seems to be attached to her. And so Casey ultimately is a track and field star, and it seems like everything is going well for her in that vein. And so reasonably, we have it to where Casey is consistently running with Doug, and we eventually have these interesting conversations, which Casey is talking about, like, oh yeah, I have a boyfriend now, and ultimately I'm not really going to talk about it, but hey, he's going to come over, and you guys are going to meet him, and all this kind of stuff. And so eventually that's where eventually Casey gets to learn that Evan stole the tuba, and that ultimately uh, we have it to where eventually Casey does hooky from school to ultimately hang out with Evan off to this park somewhere. We eventually have it to where Doug in his ambulance ultimately tracks her down, and ultimately starts talking to her about hey, what are you doing? What's going on? You're playing hooky, and what's going on? So ultimately the whole reason for her playing hooky was because Casey had learned uh, that Doug had walked out of the family. And so then Doug ultimately had to talk to Casey, because ultimately Doug was thinking that Evan was a bad influence on Casey, but no, if anything, the bad influence was Doug, because he had walked out on their family. So Doug ultimately has to explain to Casey that it's well, like like this is the reason why I left. I left uh because it all got to be too much, and ultimately to not have Sam being able to smile and hug me and stuff like that without thinking about it or whatever. Towards the end of this season, we have eventually where Sam eventually hugs Doug, and he has to tell him it's hey, that's the first time you've ever actually hug me without having to be asked or whatever. And Sam was yeah, okay. So it seems that Sam is quite possibly like it feels towards like further and further along we go into this episode that Sam is seemingly making quite a bit of progress, or not quite a bit, but like some kind of progress. It seems that more and more they're able to kind of um, tailor some of Sam's things that he does at some point, if you want to say that. Um, so Casey ultimately is to hear this and ultimately just be like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. So eventually, Casey is to eventually have this big track meet, and everybody's there. All of her family is there. She's watching Evan watch her. Ultimately, Casey's giving Evan the finger. And so we eventually have it to where this track meet goes off, and ultimately, they are Casey's ultimately to be asked, like, hey, do you want this full ride of this scholarship? Wouldn't it be great? And ultimately, Casey's like, oh my God, a scholarship? So, reasonably, we have it to where, uh, yeah, and I think there's like one episode here where I should probably really talk about that, but well, like, it's not to the transitional point yet. So, Casey ultimately full ride scholarship, everything's going well. But the only problem with this meet was that ultimately her family wasn't even there to watch her run, because right as she was going and running, every single one of her family has some uh, story thing that kind of pulls them away from the story. We ultimately have it to where Elsa is ultimately there, but she drops her phone because Nick is consistently calling her, and she drops her phone underneath the bleachers to where she has to go and run for it. And ultimately, for Elsa to go to Nick to tell him it's like, hey, well, this is over. Like, I have a family and everything like that. But it just seems like Elsa is just consistently running back to Nick at some point to try to get a little bit of something, something, if you know what I mean. So we ultimately have it to where, like I said before, Sam ends up cutting his hand on a part of Bleacher, because what ends up happening is Sam just keeps getting hit in the face by this girl's ponytail, to where eventually the consistent hitting ultimately gets him to just grab this ponytail to stop it from hitting him. Because we have it to where earlier when like all sounds all collectively together just kind of really annoys Sam. We have like at some point when he's wearing the leather jacket, like the leather jacket would just be like like every single time he would move his arm, or ultimately he would get a little cling of some metal piece that was ultimately on his leather jacket, and ultimately he would just kind of like every little thing about this jacket would make some little noise as he moved. So ultimately he just got like severely annoyed with the leather jacket to the point where he threw it away in the trash. And so ultimately we had it to where, that's the whole reason why Paige talked to Sam the second time as a conversation starter, because ultimately she liked his whale shirt, and that's when she asked him to like do something together. Uh, so reasonably, we have it to where so ultimately, yeah, Sam got his arm cut, and so ultimately, Doug wasn't paying attention when Sam was kind of getting his issue and grabbing onto this ponytail. To where ultimately, Doug is like, "Oh my God! Like, stop what you're doing!" And then ultimately, Sam ends up getting his arm cut, and to where ultimately Doug has to run and uh, take care of Sam. So everyone missed the meet, and for ultimately after Casey won, she was looking at the crowd and no one was there. She ultimately, when she went back in the back, she ultimately was like, "Hey, like, did you guys see me run?" And they're like, "Yeah, it was wonderful. Like, man, to see you run is just amazing, kind of thing." And she's like, "None of you saw the run, did you?" And they're like, "No." So we have it to where eventually it seems that Casey is having problems eventually going into college because ultimately we find out that she had punched a girl at some point. It seems like there is problems between like the ascension of this track and field like team because eventually people start to turn around one another because at some point they're kind of bitter because really they have to rely on certain people to ultimately win. And they have to rely on people to get them to a scholarship somewhere because they are a certain part of piece of this track and field team. So we get it to where eventually Casey is pulled a prank on where ultimately she goes and buys a dress for the dance that I will eventually talk about. And we have it to where Casey ends up getting her clothes taken from her to ultimately the only thing that she's wearing is this dress. So let's pull back a little bit. So let's ultimately talk about the time of which that Sam and Paige kind of we have it to where ultimately the first time that ultimately Paige and Sam were ultimately they were study dates, and then ultimately they were having dinner with the family, of course, and we ultimately have it to where uh, Sam is making a pros and cons list of Paige, and I really like this episode because we have it to where like I think Sam is being honest whether or not to be with Paige or not, but kind of like reasonably like you shouldn't have a list of like notches on like whether to be with Paige or not, and but it's kind of also underhanded for Paige to desperately try to eventually see this list because she wants to win Sam over so desperately. Like, I'm really enjoying Paige so much in this show because you have it to her Paige uh, when wanting to go into Sam's room is touching all kinds of things, and Sam ends up having to just shove her into his closet because ultimately she's touching too many things, and ultimately every single time that he would tell her to stop, she would just touch more things. To ultimately he would just put her in the closet. To ultimately Doug found her like in Sam's closet, and ultimately Paige was ultimately fine with this, and because she had read up on Sam's, let's just say, condition. So we have it to where we have this dinner, and I think this is the best episode where we have it to where Sam is ultimately listing all kinds of pros and cons, and ultimately Paige goes into the bathroom secretly to find out what all these pros and cons are, to see what she could work on, and to see if ultimately that Sam really liked her, and blah 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 blah. So it seems that Paige like snuck in because she's a sneaky little lady or woman or whatever, however you want to say it. And so reasonably we have to where Paige ultimately gets this list or this notebook that has this list, but the list doesn't no longer exist. So what she ends up doing is she ends up like scribbling on a page to see the pencil imprint of what Sam had wrote, and she ultimately read it. And while they're going onto this table to have dinner, Paige ultimately confronts Sam about oh, like, I'm sorry I'm too bossy, or I'm sorry I'm this, or I'm sorry I'm that. And we ultimately have it to where Paige kind of runs off and Sam has to run after her because he's kind of unaware of if she's upset or not. Because we have it to where, like, Sam was ultimately talking to Julia and mentioning about that Sam finds Paige annoying because, like, Paige is always there. She's always like right in front of his face, just kind of a just ba 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 kind of thing, because that's who she is. And Julia ultimately is like, well, maybe it's because Paige likes you. Do you think that could be it, Sam? And ultimately, Sam's like, well, yeah, but I don't know if I like her or not. Like, I don't know if I can make her my girlfriend. I'm like, that is a weird turn of phrase that ultimately, like, Sam goes into, like, well, maybe I can just make her my girlfriend because she just won't go away, kind of thing. Like, but, like, man, this girl just, like, drops into Sam's lap, but ultimately it's just kind of like, well, um, like there's little things here and there that ultimately make like Sam interesting to Paige, and I just kind of find that fascinating. So we eventually have it to where Sam ultimately goes and comforts Paige, and to have uh, Paige tells Sam, it's like, well, like you shouldn't have wrote like you shouldn't have kept a piece of paper for me to find, kind of thing. And so eventually it's like, oh, so is that one of the things that ultimately that ultimately you don't like and whatever. And so eventually we get to the point of where Sam is putting another pro on the list. And ultimately Sam is like, well, hey, you have more pros than cons, so I guess you'd be my girlfriend, kind of thing. And Paige is like, that's not how exactly it works. But so we have it to where eventually Sam wants to be with Paige, and eventually we get these nice little sweet moments where eventually Paige is to at some point, uh, like Sam goes out of his way to find Paige, and ultimately like announce his love for her. Like right in front of this class, and they just kiss. Uh, because it eventually gets to the point at first where Paige ultimately like says in some kind of turn of phrase of sorts, she ultimately goes like, I guess that's something that you would do for someone that you love. Because what ultimately Paige tries to do is she wants to go to this dance. And like I loved how they ended this show with this dance thing. I thought that like a lot of shows they end up having to end something with a dance, but I think the way that this like show progresses, it's just perfect. So we end up having it to where Paige ultimately is wanting to go to this dance, but realizing that Sam could have difficulties with being able to do this dance because ultimately, like music or some kind of like laser lights or whichever could ultimately just like really like give him a lot of discomfort or give him a lot of issues with doing this dance, and so reasonably Paige is coming up with a Sam proof dance kind of thing where she is ultimately coming to the community and mentioning that they could do this like silent night dance, which ultimately means you have people that can all wear like every single one of these people that are at this dance could all wear headphones to where they can hear music and they could dance to it. To ultimately Sam ultimately is not going to wear headphones and just kind of like not have to be like have any issues with sounds or anything like that, and it's going to be like a silent night dance. And so Paige is trying to Sam proof, sad to say, this dance to ultimately get it to where Sam is willing to go to this dance. And so ultimately we have it to where seemingly we have it to where I think her name is April. Ultimately I know her from Power Rangers Zeo. Um, and ultimately, good for her for getting this role because I haven't seen her in such a long time. It's kind of sad. Yeah, April. April goes into talking about the community of like, well, why should we change around this like for this family? It's like why should we have to like go through these measures uh, like just to try to uh, just over one person. It's like we have to where April mentions that like, well, hey, like if anything, like I just had my daughter's hair done, and ultimately now having headphones is going to conflict with her new hairstyle, and ultimately we have Elsa who's like, well, I'm a hairdresser and I'm willing to do anyone's hair for absolutely free. Um, if ultimately that can adjust to any headphones or whatever, and so that way everyone can go to the dance and wear these headphones. So, and Elsa also mentions that like reasonably it's like, well, hey, like my son is also just kind of singled out from like everything. Like he can't go anywhere, he can't really do anything. Yeah, we have uh Sam who ultimately has a tech job, and it seems like everything is going very smoothly with that, even when we have his absurd friend that ultimately kind of drops whatever he's doing with some kind of sale to ultimately like talk to Sam because Sam is ultimately talking about whatever thing that he needs. Because reasonably, we are progressing this story to ultimately we have it to where Sam and Paige kiss, and so reasonably we have it to where Zahid uh, is ultimately mentioning to Sam that's like, well, hey man, like like at this dance that ultimately she's gonna want to like sleep with you. So reasonably, like now you have to figure out like how you can be comfortable around a woman kind of thing, and figure out how to do the bedroom business. Let's just say, and you have to go and get protection also. Let's just say. So we have it where Sam now has to figure this all out, and he now has to be comfortable around a woman. And but the only problem is like he doesn't know, like he's too young to be able to see anything or whatever. So we ultimately have to where Sam and Hazim are ultimately going to try, I guess, to try and sneak into some uh, club of sorts that ultimately might have women that ultimately are close to being undressed of sorts. And so we have it to where Sam ultimately is outside this place, and like none like a club isn't going to work for him. And so it seems that we have it to where Sam just kind of ducks off to the side, and we have him wearing like his sound canceling headphones. And so we have it to where ultimately we have a girl that is, I guess, working at this establishment because ultimately, for reasons, she's there. Ultimately, mentioning that when she works there, she wears uh, like ear plugs, and ultimately we have it to where Sam is like, well, like that'll be great and all, but you should probably get some high end like uh, sound canceling headphones. It'll work perfectly. And so recently, Sam is being very honest with this girl and mentioning that ultimately, like, he came here just to be able to see like a woman. Because ultimately he's just kind of very nervous about being able to eventually go to the dance and maybe quite possibly pop his cherry, let's just say. So we have it to where Sam is being really nice to this girl. To ultimately, this girl is like, with this whole conversation thing, it seems that this girl eventually just goes like, "Well, like, you know what? Okay, how about I just kind of like be nice to you and let you see something. And so she ends up opening up her seemingly fur coat of sorts to have Sam see the goodies. And we ultimately have it to where Sam ultimately tries to draw what he had seen, and ultimately just to like kind of encapsulate that moment, I guess. Because it seems like we find that Sam is a really good artist when eventually Paige just kind of thumbs through his uh, notebook. She sees a lot of like um, art like things in there, which I thought was like fascinating to just see this notebook and like all of this like little hidden things about Sam, which I just thought was fascinating. So going on into here, we are eventually to try to put this whole dance thing together. We ultimately have Elsa who was talking to April and was like, "Hey, like, why is it that you're uh, trying to throw a wrench into like having my son being able to go to this dance?" And April was mentioning to Elsa, "It's like, well, I'm sick of kind of like having your family be the key to everything going on in this community." To ultimately, it's just like Casey is in this track and field team, which is ultimately going to have to get April's daughter's scholarships to go on to college because ultimately Casey is the anchor of that track and field team. And so she's kind of just bitter about that, and which ultimately leads to April's daughters being bitter towards Casey and again stealing her clothes to where Casey's just walking around in a dress. And so to where eventually Elsa has to go and speak to Casey's best friend of like, hey, like you know that I specifically buy like mint cookies for you in my home because ultimately you like mint cookies, and like I saved these just for you, Casey's best friend. Like you know that I care about you that much that ultimately like I'll have mint cookies for you. And so we have it to her we have it to her ultimately that uh, that then eventually Casey has to make up with her friend and ultimately just kind of see like what's all wrong going on with this whole like best friend relationship and so on and so forth. So pushing on, so we ultimately have it to where seemingly Sam is under some pressure. It seems that Sam eventually goes on with Paige to meet her family at some dinner place. And for some reason or another, we have it to where Sam is ultimately just going like, you know what? Like, I think that I was always supposed to be like meant to be with a Julie. Because we have it to where Sam in the early episode talked to Doug, his father, uh, about Julia, uh, or Julia. So, and mention that's like, well, hey, like I want to be with Julia. I think like she'll be like, she's the one for me. And Doug is kind of talking him down. He's like, no, like you need to find a girl your age, and if anything, but and then so reasonably Sam is like, well, so are you meaning that like I need a starter girl before I end up with Julia? Like to have like somebody that I'm just kind of like working out the kinks out or whatever, or the not the kinks, that's a little bit too much. Um like the prototype girl, if you want to, like the rough draft before I get to the final draft, if you know what I mean, kind of thing. And like Doug is like, no, like I think you just need to find somebody that's your age. But Sam is a little bit stubborn, and so ultimately, while at this dinner, like Sam eventually just blurts out that he's like, I think I need to be with Julia. And so reasonably right there in the dinner of Paige and her family, Sam breaks up with Paige, and I'm like, no. Like, man, this relationship was going so well. And we also had like Julia that ultimately was it seems like her like relationship was having some trouble, and it seems like Sam was kind of getting a little bit of knowledge of that at some points, but eventually we find out that at some point within this whole entire season, so this is kind of going through like a lot of everything. And so ultimately somebody might see it because like, dude, I wanted like an episode to episode kind of rundown, which ultimately I'm not doing that, sadly enough. So we ultimately have it to where we find Julia is pregnant at some point, and ultimately it seems like she thinks that her husband is having an affair with her, and so on and so forth. And so we have it to where Sam runs off to go to Julia and tell her that he loves her, and that ultimately he wants to be with her because ultimately Julia and him at some point had slow dance together uh, because Julia had a family member of hers who was autistic, and so ultimately her helping kids like this is just kind of her like her thing that she loves to do and she enjoys. And so ultimately when Sam was trying to figure out like, oh, I don't know how to slow dance. Like I think because ultimately Sam was just like, I think I can do kind of like this dance that I know, but I don't think I can slow dance. For ultimately Julia is helping him figure out how to slow dance, and so we have it to where Sam is figuring out after this slow dance that ultimately that Julia might be into him, which is not the fact at all. So we ultimately have it to where Sam goes to Julia and confesses his love to ultimately Julia is saying like, no, there's no way that we can do this. It's unprofessional. I'll lose my license, and ultimately like I can't lose my job. If anything, I have tons and tons of debt, and all this stuff is weighing on her because she finds out that she's pregnant, as well as her client is ultimately having seemingly a relationship, or not a relationship, but like a connection with her in a almost love like manner. And so reasonably, Julia is kind of like, no, there's no way that this is going to happen. And eventually it gets to the point to where Julia is talking to Doug, and because Sam confesses that he had broken to her house to give her chocolate, and that's when Julia figures out that like, oh, it wasn't my husband, it was this kid. And so ultimately, Julia confronts Doug about the chocolate situation and stuff like that, and Doug didn't realize it was her. He just realized it was some young girl, but it wasn't some young girl. It was a much older girl, and because Doug didn't know all the factors, because ultimately, like Doug is trying to support his son, but ultimately he's not asking enough questions. He's ultimately not 100% like watching over his son at all times thing, and that's what ultimately kind of consistently snowballs with Sam to doing the wrong things, when kind of when ultimately Doug is not 100% always like attached to Sam's hip, let's just say, just kind of watching over him. So we have it to where uh, Julia and Doug are talking this out, and ultimately, like, they're just kind of like, well, like, if anything, we're just gonna kind of let everything go, and like the talk between Julia and Doug, and ultimately have like Doug is mentioning to Julia, it's like, yeah, kind of keep your distance. It's like if anything, Sam's getting the wrong idea, and blah 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 blah. So we push on to this dance. And so this theme of this dance is kind of just Silent Night. It seems like eventually Sam is coming up with a consensus to have as a backstory, but really just to kind of have a piece of something for this dance. Ultimately, Sam asked Doug to make them an igloo for this dance, and ultimately, Doug is like, "Heck yeah, I'll make you an igloo!" Like, yeah, like so. Ultimately, he makes the igloo, and I thought that this was really fascinating because when Paige goes to confront uh, Sam, because we find out that Sam had given Paige a penguin necklace that ultimately she had lost. And so ultimately, considering Paige and Sam are broken up, Paige ultimately shouts out to the heavens that they are broken up, and she is like tossing all around like all the stuff that ties her to Sam, and she's tearing it up. And I thought that this was like a hilarious moment, but ultimately I was just like, man, like this is so interesting, and I'm like, come on, Sam, win her back, kind of thing. Like, try to like do some kind of tender moment, which ultimately like wins Paige over. So Paige ultimately is tearing all this stuff up right in front of Sam, and eventually, like, Paige had gotten some gigantic penguin that ultimately she had cut the throat of, and like tossed some like stuff that was inside of it out, and then she just kind of walked off, and evidently Doug had used that stuffing from that penguin to help do his igloo, which I thought was interesting. So we eventually have it to where ultimately, uh, so we have it to where we're at this dance, and so uh, Sam is trying to make a romantic gesture to win Paige over, and so ultimately he is going and trying to find this penguin necklace, and the penguin necklace was ultimately at this pool, so he has to dive into the pool uh, to give Sam this necklace. So Sam shows up with the necklace, and ultimately this is a romantic gesture to win Sam over. And so eventually we have it to where Sam ultimately needs to or Paige needs to talk to Sam in the igloo. So we have it to where ultimately uh, Casey ends up finding out that Elsa is cheating on Doug with some other guy. She ends up finding out, and then eventually she ends up scribbling on Elsa's to-do list to stop banging the bartender. And so we end up having Casey kind of distraught about this whole dance, eventually desperately needing Evan to be there for her and just to talk things out. And so eventually, because we have it to where Elsa is trying to make it to this party of sorts, that ultimately this birthday party that ultimately Nick is throwing. So we ultimately have it to where Paige and Sam are in this igloo, and after Sam dances with Casey, and Casey mentions to Sam, it's like, well, like, what are you gonna do if our parents aren't exactly together? And Sam is like, well, I'll just wait for them to come home. And like, and Casey is trying to talk to Sam about like kind of what's going on, and Sam is just kind of having a slight disconnect with everything. So we ultimately have it to where Sam is going on into the igloo, and we ultimately have it to where Sam isn't 100% sure uh, of that he loves Paige or not. And so Paige is just like, well, like I'll take that. If anything, we'll just kind of go slow, but ultimately we have it to where Paige gives Sam a handy anyways in the igloo, um, to ultimately just be like yet another romantic gesture. And ultimately, we have it to where Sam ultimately gets out of the igloo and mentions basically to everybody that ultimately he had gotten a handy from Paige. And like, there's a lot of times where there are these like odd looks, like in between like all these family members and whatever, but they're just kind of like, well, we'll just let it go, like whatever. Like if anything, there's some times where ultimately, like Elsa or Doug are just kind of like really they're really trying to be like really attentive parents, and they're trying to just kind of see what's going on with their kids, but recently they're letting a lot of stuff go. They're letting a lot of stuff fly. They're like, man, whatever, it's just kids being kids. If anything, like when looking at it, Elsa and Doug were probably reckless in their youth. So looking at it, it's like, let's just have our kids be reckless. Let's ultimately, like, yeah, like try to avoid them from going to prison. But when also looking at it, it's like, just let them be kids. Just let them be young, and just let them just end up getting handy, I guess, in an igloo, which is perfectly fine. So we ultimately have it to where guy's getting a handy in the igloo, and he steps out, and so ultimately they're just letting it slide for that. And so reasonably, like uh, we know that there is quasi love between Sam and Paige, and we're ultimately just letting that go. So reasonably, we have to where Elsa is coming back from her party of sorts, and uh, so we ultimately have to where Elsa is making it back to the house. It seems that Casey is going off to be with Evan, ultimately talking about her future. Like it seemed a point at some point when Evan is sitting down with the family, ultimately mentioning that blah, 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 blah. Eventually Evan is mentioning that Casey is going to go off to college, and he doesn't know if their relationship is going to hold up. And like eventually, it was funny to see Paige mentioning how like she was tearing up all these things, and the one thing that she couldn't tear up was the her virginity, because she was like, yeah, I was gonna give my virginity to you, Sam. I was gonna give it up to you, but ultimately I guess now I just have to wait till I get with some British guy somewhere. And so that's ultimately where Sam is like, no, you, me, that's it, baby. So he kind of does a romantic gesture to win her over. Um, so we ultimately have to where Elsa is coming back home, and we also have Doug, who is eventually coming back home to ultimately realize that there is a to-do list on the board that says "Stop banging the bartender," and so we ultimately have it to where Doug confronts Elsa about like, well, hey, like, why is this on your to-do list? What is going on? And so that's where we have the huge kind of confronting moment where it's like, oh my god, what's gonna happen with this couple? What's gonna happen? Um, because we have it to where Elsa is almost spilling the beans to almost everybody, to where even when Doug is in the car, like she is seeing a stop sign that says the word SU or SLUT. Helps if I could. I've been tossing a few back, everybody. No, I haven't. And she's ultimately just kind of spilling to people that she has had an affair and get off of her back about it, and so on and so forth. It seems like she's spilling to everyone in town about it, and she had probably spilled to the wrong person, and that's what happens. So, because ultimately you have it to where we have it to where the intercom of this grocery store is mentioning that Elsa is open for business, and it that's not going off in the actual store; it's just going off in her mind. And so, reasonably at the tail end of that, we just have this whole thing where reasonably now that that Elsa is being confronted with her affair, and that's how the show ends. And ultimately, I think that's all I'm going to talk about because that's like I thought that this show was really great. Um, like it had a lot of very romantic moments, and it was very good, and I enjoyed it. There was a lot of stuff about Elsa and Doug that I kind of had to just kind of just skip out and talk about because there's just I don't want to spend that kind of time. I don't have that kind of time. Um, to ultimately just talk about all that, like the little kind of moments where, like Elsa is won over by Doug, but she's still going to eventually just kind of land herself into being with Nick to the point where she's going off to a bar to ultimately get hit with some dart, where ultimately he has to take care of her, and so on and so forth. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. There's probably a lot that I had to kind of skip around and kind of go all over the place with this one. And reasonably, there was a lot of stuff that ultimately I left out as well. But it's just it was going to be really difficult to be able to review a show that kind of really much more ties into a whole entire family, and how am I going to separate all that and kind of do this review as a entire season and so on and so forth. So I think with that, I'm going to call that a wrap here today. So I'm going to go out of my way to say goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.